Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I can see that the numbers are stabilizing. So firstly, welcome. Thank you for coming along to this special online webinar. My name is Bella. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of South Australia. And as we are gathering online today from across Australia, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. So this is a special event, which is the result of a community impact grant where we've teamed up with Pint of Science Australia, a non-for-profit organisation, to run this online accessible event that's really meant to showcase and highlight the amazing environmental psychology research that is happening across Australia. What is environmental psychology, you might be asking? Well, that's really about us and our relationship to the environment around us. So including the built environment, the natural environment, increasingly the online environment as well. Today, I'm joined by three fantastic researchers from across Australia who are doing some really exciting research in this field. That includes Dr. Alexandra Kleeman, Associate Professor Oliver Baumann, and Professor Xiaoqi Feng. So first up, we're going to hear from Dr. Alexandra Kleeman. She's a postdoctoral research fellow in the Healthy Livable Cities Lab at RMIT University. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow you to kick us off, Alex.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen now. Can everyone see that okay and hear me okay? Yep, great. Okay, so thanks so much for organizing, Bella. Appreciate it. So I'm just going to move that. Okay, so I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking to you from today. I recognise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first people of Australia whose sovereignty was never ceded, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So today I'm going to touch on a little bit about my background and how I got into research. Then I'm going to get into some of the main findings from the High Life study, my PhD, and what we're up to now. So back in 2015, I started a Master of Public Health at the University of Melbourne, and I hadn't 100% decided where I wanted to go with that, but I'd always been curious about research. And then I heard about the Macaque Research Unit and the goal of their research, which was to build knowledge about the environmental determinants of health. And Billy Giles Cortai, who some of you may have heard of, was the director of the Macaque unit at the time. And I reached out to her to say I was interested and ended up working on a report on apartment design with her and a colleague, Sarah Foster, that was commissioned by the Office of Victorian Government Architect. So that was a really great experience, and I found that I really liked research. So I kept in touch with Billy and Sarah and started a PhD under their supervision in 2017. And by this point, we were all at RMIT University in the Healthy Livable Cities research group. Sarah had a couple of research grants that she'd recently been awarded to conduct a study called High Life. And my PhD looked at a very sort of small piece of the pie of this overall research study. And throughout my PhD, I also worked as a research assistant on the main High Life study to help deliver on the core study objectives as well as my PhD. So I'll jump into an overview of the High Life study first. Australia is relatively new to apartment living compared to some countries, but there has been a bit of an apartment construction boom in more recent years. There's also some concerns about the quality and the amenity of the apartments that are being built. And in response to some of these concerns, several Australian states have legislated new apartment design guidelines. And the aim of the High Life study was to investigate the impact that these design policies were having on the ground, so on the buildings that were being constructed, and in turn, how these buildings were impacting the health and well-being of the residents. So we looked at this in 3 cities across Australia. We looked at Melbourne, Sydney, and we looked at Perth as well. And these are just the High Life study objectives in the boxes across the top there. So we wanted to measure the implementation of policy-specific design requirements. We wanted to compare this between cities, compare it by area disadvantage, and identify associations with health and well-being outcomes. And so overall, the study included 172 buildings from 113 developments. That's because some complexes had multiple buildings within them. This is a snapshot of how the data was collected. So we randomly sampled buildings meeting a certain set of criteria. So they had to be constructed between 2006 to 2016. They had to be 3 stories in height, have a certain number of residents, those sorts of things. Then we also made sure we had access to their building plans. So the building floor plates and elevations that were submitted with the approved development applications. And finally, we invited the residents of these buildings to complete a survey that included questions about their apartment design and their health. We had about 1,300 residents who got back to us, and you can see there on the right-hand side that approximately 60% identified as female, about 2/3 had some level of tertiary education, about half came from a household income of 100,000 a year, half lived with a partner, and only 10% had children living at home with them. And in terms of the buildings we measured, and in terms of the buildings that we sampled, we measured the design of all of the apartments. So that was over 10,000 of them using the building plans that we'd sourced. So it wasn't just limited to measuring the apartments of those who completed the survey, we measured all of them. We focused on quantifiable design features that could impact on health and well-being. So we reviewed the 3 state policies for these requirements or these sort of design objectives at the top of the table here. So things like solar and daylight access, natural ventilation, space, privacy, those sorts of things. And this slide just sort of shows the number of requirements that were measured from each state policy for each of the design objectives. And so you can see that the New South Wales and Western Australian policy included more measurable design requirements than the Victorian policy in the bottom row there. This is just a few pictorial examples of the different policy-specific design requirements that we measured. So we looked at things like, the overall size of the apartment or bedrooms, the orientation or aspect of the apartment, presence of windows, room depths, or where rooms were located in relation to, balconies and living spaces, that sort of thing. So onto whether, is design policy being implemented on the ground? We did a lot of analysis of these objectively measured design requirements, but I'll just touch on some of the big takeaway findings, with a lot of this work being primarily led by Sarah Foster, the chief investigator of the study, and some of our colleagues over in Western Australia. Essentially, we looked at each city against its own state level policy and developed scores that reflect how well the building was performing against its policy. So Sydney buildings against the New South Wales policy, Perth buildings against the WA policy, and Melbourne against the Victorian policy. And then to compare the buildings between cities, we also assessed all the buildings against all the possible design requirements across the 3 policies, regardless of whether they actually applied in that city. I'll just present the pooled results here. So these are the average policy compliance scores that we had for each city. So you can see that, overall things sat a little bit in the middle, maybe private open space, more in the middle of the table. It was a little bit higher than some of the other design themes, or scored a bit higher. But one of the clearest trends that emerged was that Melbourne apartment buildings, that symbolised in the little grey box, scored lowest across pretty much all of the design themes. It's at the bottom there. And if you look over on the far left of the table at the total implementation column, that column there just incorporates all the other design themes listed across on the right-hand side. So everything combined into that one total implementation column there. And Sydney achieved, about 60% policy compliance overall, Perth about 55%, and Melbourne only 43%. And those figures are just summarised again here, both for the pooled results and the state-specific results, so how that city performed against its own policy. And again, overall, we've got Sydney and Perth doing relatively better than Melbourne buildings, on average meeting between 55 to 60% of the requirements, whereas Melbourne's only meeting about 40%. Okay, so now on to what that all means for apartment residents and their health and well-being. So for this data, we drew from the resident survey with just a little reminder on the right-hand side here of our sample and these sort of people that responded to us. This model here is just sort of showing the conceptual model we were working with to link policy with health. So over on the left-hand side, we've got the 3 state policies. Then in the next column, we've got the how they are being implemented in apartment buildings. And then the next column again, we've got how that implementation is impacting their perceptions of their apartment amenity. So, for example, does good solar and daylight compliance correspond with good, feeling that you have good access to natural light. And then finally, how that perception of your amenity links with your mental well-being. That's the sort of framework we were investigating. So in our analysis, we found that the objective policy implementation of these 6 design themes over on the left-hand side was associated with residents' perceptions of them. So, for example, a higher policy compliance with indoor space requirements was associated with perceiving that you had a more spacious, functional, flexible internal space in your apartment. So, many of those objective and subjective measures were linked. Then we did further analysis and found that all of the perceptions in the second column there were positively associated with greater mental well-being. But this was just in initial models that adjusted for sociodemographics. And in further models, with all the perceptions analysed together, we found that those 4 highlighted there remained independently and significantly associated with positive well-being. So this included access to fresh air or natural ventilation, summer thermal comfort, indoor space, and communal area quality. So I suppose the take-home message here is that policy implementation impacted residents' apartment perceptions, which impacted their well-being. Just a disclaimer, no one's expected to read all the text on this slide. So what I've just put here, this is a list of all the individual design requirements that we measured for each apartment. There are about 90 or so things. And what we wanted to do with the next stage of the analysis was take a different approach to the data that wasn't constrained by looking at everything in terms of their overall design themes. We wanted to look at the performance of the buildings in terms of the combination or mix of all these different requirements that they had. So we ran what's called a cluster analysis, which grouped the buildings into 2 typologies or clusters. And at the top of the page there, you've got cluster 1 buildings, which is what we broadly termed the high policy performance buildings. So they were characterized by having a greater implementation of lots of different design requirements. While the cluster 2 buildings on the bottom were what we called the low policy performance buildings, because they had significantly poorer implementation of design requirements compared to the buildings in cluster 1. And importantly, residents in the high policy performance buildings with greater implementation of that whole range of different design requirements had significantly higher positive mental well-being compared with those in the low policy performance buildings. So essentially, the results just show that where this combination of design features was implemented, there was a direct association with residents' positive mental health. So design requirements relating to certain solar and daylight access. So things like having dual aspect apartments where you have a lot of light coming in, acoustic and visual privacy requirements. So adhering to building separation standards, for example, indoor and private open space or balcony requirements being met, communal open space, circulation space. Just a few different things from these sort of design elements that were really coming through as important for mental well-being. And ultimately, we think that these results can be used to advocate for either adopting specific design requirements where they may be currently missing from some policies, or retaining design requirements in future iterations or versions of the policies. So essentially either adding them into future versions or protecting them from getting rolled back in further sort of policy review. It's also worth noting that the high policy performance buildings were very well represented in Sydney, we found, accounting for 85% of the buildings in our Sydney sample, but they only accounted for about half the buildings in Perth and 10% in Melbourne. So that just emphasises how important policy is in a booming market. Victoria had the weakest policy provisions overall. So the fact that there were so few high performance buildings in Melbourne might indicate that industry won't necessarily deliver good outcomes if it's left to its own devices. You might need policy there to protect against that. So overall, the High Life study really just underscores the importance of policy implementation in delivering high quality apartments. There's still a lot of work to be done across all the policies, maybe some more than others, but overall policy implementation led to better perceptions and experiences of apartment living and better mental well-being among residents. And just to briefly touch on my PhD and its role within the High Life study, if I've got some time. I looked at communal areas to see if there was any relationship between them and residents' social outcomes. And over the course of my PhD, I published 4 papers covering various stages of this. So I looked predominantly at outdoor areas, things like courtyards, gardens, rooftop terraces, and I developed an audit tool that assessed the features of each of these areas that was in our sample. I did this remotely because there were some issues with physically going in and accessing all the buildings in our sample. And I used these 3 data sources here. So photographs of communal areas sourced from real estate listings, marketing materials, that sort of thing. The building plans that we'd sourced and Google Earth imagery as well. After I'd audited all the areas, I used the survey data to explore how frequently residents were using their spaces. And so in general, about 70% of residents were using them a few times a year, but then 50% or more were using them a few times a month. I then analysed this against my audit data and found that higher use of communal areas was associated with certain types of features being present. So things like areas that have a lot of greenery in them, or shelter, or seating or dining arrangement, barbecues, pools, those sorts of things that really encourage people to go there and use the space. And you might remember those policy scores that were generated for the High Life study that I touched on briefly before. You can see communal space scores in the middle of the column there, with Sydney performing a bit better than Perth and Melbourne. So after looking at those micro scale features that I audited against use, I also looked at these policy scores against use and found that pretty much across the board, policy implementation was associated with increased use. So you can see there for the Victorian policy at the top, every 10% increase in implementation increased the odds of using a communal area by 20%. And it was higher still for the other policies and pooled results. And then finally, I looked at this all in relation to neighbouring behaviour, so chatting with your neighbours, that sort of thing, and loneliness, and found that the use of communal areas had flow-on effects. It was associated with higher neighbouring, which in turn was protective against loneliness. So I suppose the takeaway message of all that is that where certain types of features are present, like greenery and seating, and more of the policy implementation is there for communal spaces, residents are more likely to use the space, which fosters interaction. So it really just means that quality of a communal area is really important and necessary built environment factor through its impact on use, which then impacts social outcomes. Okay, and just to wrap up, if I have 2 seconds, promise it's the last slide. So I currently have a postdoc role working on some High Life follow-up studies. So we're looking at a movers and stayers study where we follow a subset of our participants to see if they've moved or stayed in their apartment and what design factors might be influencing that decision. We also followed up with our participants during the pandemic to see if their perceptions of their apartment or health behaviours had changed. And we're just in the process of publishing a few papers on that now. And finally, we're about to look at the parks around these apartment buildings to see if and how residents use them. And I think I'm probably over time, so I'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much for listening. This is my contact details and the High Life research team.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Alex. That was a fantastic presentation. I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them into the Q&A and we will get to them at the end. And for those who joined us late or where my connection broke, just to recap, this is an online webinar about environmental psychology research in Australia, which is supported through a community impact grant from the American Psychological Association and through Pint of Science Australia. So our second speaker, I'm delighted to announce, is Associate Professor Oliver Baumann, who's in the Faculty of Society and Design at Bond University. Oliver, I'll let you share your slides.
Thank you. Yes, so good afternoon. So my presentation is on 2 studies that I recently conducted on the effects of nature views on cognition and emotion. And so what's the starting problem for me? Looking at urbanization. So if we look at over global population growth, it's kind of slowing down a little bit, but actually the number of people that move into cities is predicted to further grow and grow. So we will have more big cities and the existing big cities will become even bigger. And that comes with certain challenges, as you can see on the picture here, how some big cities can look like, because we get extra pollution. There's also stress, from traffic, from noise, pollutant stress, and also things like inactivity. So that's often can be quite hard to actually get active, and also, so therefore for relaxation in those big cities. And that creates a variety of physical and mental health conditions that have been mapped out already. So that goes pretty much almost all organs in the body, and also mentally there can be negative effects of big city living. But obviously we cannot just get rid of big cities, and also we don't really want to, because urbanization also has really good aspects. So productivity goes up, so work productivity goes up, and also poverty actually goes down. So you would not have people literally starving to death in cities. So that happens in rural areas. So it means if people move to cities, actually that really, reduces poverty. And also cultural and technological innovations are also kind of powered by city living, by just bringing together, many experts in one place really helps that innovation. So we can't and don't want to get rid of cities. So what can we do to alleviate those negative aspects? And one aspect is to bring nature into the cities to create more livable cities. And because there's, for decades now, lots of evidence that nature has beneficial effects on mental and physical health. There are many reasons for that, including evolutionary ones, that just seeing greenery, seeing water probably signals to us that, it's a place where we can find food, and, which is obviously important for survival. So even at a kind of subconscious level, seeing greenery might just put us more at peace. And, even just looking at that picture here, that's a picture from Korea, from Seoul, where you see like an inner city park and river. And I'm just going to show you a picture how that looked just a couple of years ago. So that's how it looked before. So obviously the river was always there, but they built those roads just on top of the river. And then they made a design decision recently to remove the roads and bring the river back and install that park. And yeah, just imagine here, living or working in those buildings, looking down, how you feel, and then bringing you back, how it would feel to live and work here and looking down on the river. So that's quite, evident that it's, makes you feel different. So there's kind of this, our implicit understanding that nature is good for us in inner city spaces, but we still need research to assess its effectiveness, to kind of just show how effective it is for certain aspects of physical and mental health, what aspects of nature are the most effective on, because obviously there's limited amount of money and space to implement those changes. So therefore having empirical evidence that guides those design decisions will be important to make most of the limited means that we have. And that's kind of what my research is about. But looking back, how did I start to become interested in that? So I did many years of research actually on how we navigate space and also how we memorize space. So that was where I initially started, using real world environments, but also those virtual kind of environments, and then putting people in fMRI scanners to just see what brain areas support spatial memory. And then after doing that for a while, I thought, can I get some applied use out of that research? And so I kind of flipped the questions. So rather than how we process space, into how does space affect us? So affect us in terms of how we think, feel, and behave. And we can apply that to a range of environments, like home environments, public environments, but also office environments. And that's actually, office environments is a good example, because that's where most of the money is, because companies often have an intrinsic interest on investigating that. And there are a variety of factors. So it's obviously good to try to break down the factors that have an effect. So we can look at geometry of indoor spaces, textures, but lots of other things like daylight, greenery, and so on. And then there are also many functions, broadly speaking, emotion, how we feel, cognition, how we think, behavior, how we what we do. But obviously we can break that down further in sub-functions. And that's what we did in the first studies. This was a very specific question, looking at the effects of daylight infiltration and nature views in a kind of office environment on alertness. So how people are able to react to an event. So if they're drowsy or awake, looking at short-term memory. So how many items they can kind of keep in mind and operate on while being in those environments. And then also measuring their creative output and their self-reported mood. We didn't do that in this instance in a real world office, but in a virtual simulated office. And so we had one without any daylight and nature views. Then we had an intermediate option where there was no nature views, but there was now some virtual daylight infiltration. So obviously important is no real daylight, so we don't get any hormonal effects of being actually exposed to UV or actual light, but there's still the aesthetic component of the daylight coming in. And then we had the last condition where there's not only the daylight, but also, there are some trees visible from the outside. And then we tested the alertness using an auditory reaction time task. Then there was also auditory short-term memory task where we measured the ability to keep items in mind. We looked at their creative output in terms of their ability to generate unique or kind of novel uses of everyday items. And then mood was measured by safe reports. And so that's how it looked to the participants, how it looked in real life. So that's the lab where the participant has the VR glasses on while being the environment, and we can administer those tasks via speakers. The advantage of using VR is the experimental control or the scientific rigor here, so that obviously we could use a real life office with those conditions, but the problem is we cannot control the weather. So maybe there will be a rainy day, a sunny day, the position of the sun is changing, there could be planes flying by, and there could be also people walking by the office, making noise and so on. So the advantage of VR is really that we can just focus on some specific factors and rule out other random factors impacting our experiment. So what did we find here? We didn't find a significant difference between the only daylight condition and the no daylight condition, but there was a significant positive effect of the nature view condition. And so where we found an increase in creative output, also an increase in positive mood as well. And so that's then not due to the daylight alone. So it's really just down to the fact just seeing some trees outside that led to those performance increases here. We didn't detect anything in terms of alertness and memory, so that alertness could be a factor. Maybe we would see that in the real world, but not in a simulated environment. But also importantly, the participants only operated for like 15 minutes in those environments, so that might not be enough to actually have measurable effects on kind of drowsiness or alertness. But overall, that's already kind of a neat story. In the sense that window view matters, and obviously that finding, while we use kind of an office environment, that also affects home environments and public buildings like hospitals, schools. So it could be as simple as just having some freeze and scrubs outside in terms of boosting well-being, and in this case also creative output. So that was the first study. The second one, we wanted to see, okay, VR has all these advantages, but can we do similar kind of studies in the real world? So while still trying to control as many factors as we can. So we wanted to compare kind of a low density environment to a high density one. So high density had less greenery, and I will show you a close-up view in a second, while there was more greenery in the low density environment, and then still wanting to see, what are the effects on mood and other physiological correlates. So we had them here in the low density environment, high density environment, looking at self-reports in terms of mood, safety, overall well-being, but also complement that with heart rate measures and EEG activity to get some objective sense to kind of correlate those self-reports, to kind of see if we get a matching story across those measures. And so that's another view, kind of like a almost panorama view of the two locations. And we found overall, or on all measures, the low density suburban environment was beneficial. So people reported a higher positive mood. That was also corroborated by the objective measures by finding a lower heart rate in that environment and higher EEG theta activity, which is also in other studies has been shown to be related to enhanced relaxation and also enhanced creativity. And while we obviously could not control all the factors in the real world, we did our best so that we always had the same time of day. So this was like a within subject design. So we first tested, half of the participant in the one location, then moved to the other. So this was the same time of day. It therefore would also be the same temperature and UV and all that. We also actually, while we acquired those measurements, we asked them to close their eyes and put earplugs in. And that was to kind of just measure the lingering impacts of the two different environments, but not be disturbed by any cars driving by or people driving by while walking by while we took those measures here. And so therefore, combining those two studies, the take-home message is that incorporating nature into urban designs increases overall well-being and also productivity. Specifically, we found it in creativity, and it might show up in other measures as well. And also it shows that we can use psychological measures to kind of go beyond just self-reports and subjective impressions, but really use heart rate, EEG, to further kind of really measure the degree of impact that those natural aspects have in urban designs. And just to close, obviously, thanking you for your attention. And here's also kind of a plug for Bond University, just showing kind of that it's also possible to integrate a university into a lot of greenery. And so both of those studies, by the way, have been published now. So the second one just accepted literally today. So if any of you in the audience would like to get a copy of one of those studies, please feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to send those studies to you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Oliver. I will also say we are recording the session today, and we'll make that available and the details. So you can get in touch. We will go through the question and answers at the end, but just in case we don't answer everyone's questions, because there's some fantastic ones coming in, and keep them coming, we will still address them. So now to introduce our third speaker, we've got Professor Xiaoqi Feng. Xiaoqi is a professor of urban health and environment in the School of Population Health at UNSW. Thank you, Xiaoqi.
Great. Thank you very much, Val, in organizing this great webinar and also opportunities to speak, everyone. I just want to check whether you can hear me very well, because I haven't wearing my earphone. Maybe I should.
We can hear you, yes. We can't see your slides yet, but we can certainly hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, can you see my slides now?
We can. Terrific.
Wonderful. Thank you. I would like to present my research and also discuss with you greening and the mental health. So I think just let us close your eyes and maybe relaxing for a second. But if you're driving, don't do that. Just think about how often do you visit your green space, your local green space, and what you normally do. Is that some nice walk in a forest or exploring something? Maybe there is a food festival. Maybe you play soccer and with your children, friends, and maybe there's a music festival. Or just simply find a space, lie down, sit at a bench, relaxing. Or maybe just talk with your friends and walking around. And we all know that the green space bring a lot of joy for us and potentially even health benefits. But where are the scientific evidence to show? So my research lab, Power Lab, I call Direct. We have developed a series of research publications in the last 10 years to demonstrate the benefits between green space and health. And also we provide a lot of local evidence that in Australia. So if you're interested to look at those mountains of papers, please feel free to visit our website. And I'm glad that our research is not just cited by our peers, but also has been used in making local policies. For example, Greening Sydney Strategy is consulted us and also used our research directly making their policy. They're aiming to have 30% or eventually get 40% of tree canopies and green space in Sydney. That is because my and my team's research continually provide scientific evidence to show that we need 30% or more tree canopies and green space in our neighborhood, enable us to keep healthy out of hospital. If you are living in Sydney or coming to visit us, and you may notice we have a little bit more greener than before. Just in the last few years, that there's over 1 million trees have planted in Sydney. I think this is a really good start. And also, I'm glad my research was able to help the disadvantaged communities, such as some people living a part of the Western Sydney, where if you have been there, you know, it's a diabetes hotspot, but also in holidays, it's really hot. The great difference between inland Western Sydney and eastern suburbs, where like UNSW based on Australian, it could be 5-6 degree difference. But they also lack of green space, tree canopies. And I know that my colleagues in council and even in health sector, we are working together to change this and make Western Sydney more greener and healthier. So one may say, okay, well, but tell us why green space good for our mental health. What kind of pathway? I have that question too, and actually many of the researchers, some of them you may recognize, this is go back about 6-7 years ago, well before the pandemic, and we all meet in Germany, and those researchers are special on green space and health, and we developed this theoretical framework and looking about the pathway between green space and health. So when we're talking about green space, how it benefits mental health. And one pathway is building capacity. So when we're going to the park and on other nature place, you might do some physical activity. It could be a jogging, and I'll just walk around, and after a bit sweaty and feel tired, it's good for our sleep. And potentially you also go there with your family or friends, and all these good for our mental health. But also the other pathway is restoring. I don't know you, but I certainly have those days feel absolutely exhausted, or maybe it's a bit passive or negative. And I'm going to my local parks or have a walk in the nature. After 2 or 3 hours, I feel very relaxed and also much more positive. And also the third pathway I want to introduce is reducing the harm. We know green space can reducing the heat and also noise and even air pollution. And we know that in a hot day, we potentially feel quite angry, and also not a lot of tolerance to a lot of noise. And also a lot of research now showing air pollution is strongly associated with depression. So this is how I see that green space and how it could benefit the mental health, where those 3 major pathways. It's not just physical activities, many other ways as well. So no surprise, I hope, that more green space, better mental health. But some green space are better than others. We all know that. However, there's not much research actually have looked at that about green space quality. And we know that matters. You want to go to a park if you think this green space is not high quality, right? And I want to show you some research examples from my team and me, and to show that the relationship between green space quality and the mental health. So this is a work we conducted by using Australia children longitudinal study. So we were interested in whether green space quantity and the quality matters for our children's mental health well-being. Not surprise, green space quantity matters. But also, not only green space quantities matter to our children's mental health, as you can see from this graph, that children who live in a really good green space quality, the high rate is really high compared to their peers who living with not high quality, and their mental health already have a big gap when they are 4 to 5 years old. But when they grow up, and you can tell this mental health gap even wider, we really need to think not just to provide the quantity, the green space for us to access, but also the quality, because this is really important. And this is another one. And again, we're really interested about the quantity and the quality of green space, but on women, especially the new moms and who just give birth. And we find if moms live with a lot of green space, actually there was not any statistic significant show that this could benefit to their mental health. But we find if moms living with high quality green space, that could reduce the risk developing the postpartum psychological distress about 20% lower out, which is fantastic. Because as you may know, that 1 of 5 Australian women after give birth, they suffer mental distress. This is actually by doctor diagnosed. But we also know just after give birth and naturally hormones substantially draw down, and people will have few days or few weeks or even months, those very blue days. And so if we could provide the green space and also make sure they're high quality, and we can get these massive benefits to our moms, women. And I think this is great. We should really think about how we can improve quality. During pandemic, my team, we also conducted a national survey, and where we looked at about whether people would have more interaction with green space. And this is actually done after all the lockdown. And when people, they actually still, a lot of them working from home. And we find that people said higher quality green space, and they feel more connected with the neighbors, and also feel more active and also relaxed. I think this is so important. But as you may say here, that when we measure green space quality here is by we asking people how they feel about green space in their neighborhood. But it's not really objectively measured, because I could think a park great because you have an area I could off leash my dog. But for the same reason, my neighbor may hate it because there are dogs running around. So we would like to learn more if green space quality so means a lot to us, and what does green space quality means, especially if we can objectively measure it. So with that in our mind, we put a successful grant application now funded by NHMRC and UKRI, and I colleagued with Professor Rich Michaud at the University of Glasgow. And we have consulted with our consumers and a lot of us, and also industry partners, policymakers, and to learn what the park quality in their mind. But then now we are start objectively measure those park features and the quality, and then see how it impacts on our mental and physical health. And we hope that soon we'll have some result to report. Now we have green space access, a lot of green space, and as you see, the government is actually working on it. And also, we are also working on what kind of park quality we need, and the job done, all good. But this is what surprised us. And when we conduct this national survey, just after all this lockdown during the pandemic still, we find 33% Australian adults actually doesn't even spend 2 hours a week in any kind of nature. And you would have thought people working from home, they may have a little bit more time to go outdoor, going to their local parks and going to the nature. But that's not the case. And they can't take all the benefits that I just laid out earlier. But 82% of Australian adults said they would love to visit nature more often if their doctor actually recommended, and if this is good for their health. And a lot of people call those doctor referred visiting nature or interactive nature called nature prescription. So with that in our mind, I'm thinking how we can bring people to nature, and does nature prescription even work? So we conducted this systematic review, just published a few weeks ago. If you're interested, you can scan this barcode or just Google it. It's an open access article. We looked at about the nature prescription global wide, and we find that nature prescription does work. It's increased walking, reduce blood pressure, and reduce depression and anxiety. But I guess the question is, So how we implement nature prescription. It's popular in some other countries already, such as in Canada, in UK, and there are over 10,000 GP in Canada even signed up to issue nature prescription. But it's not the same in Australia. And we really want to know how we can implement nature prescription if it provides all these benefits. But we also hope that it's sustainable and actable, and that nature prescription won't just be a luxury item to the rich people. So we applied and also funded by MRFF on this PANDA trial. We are just about to run, which we are going to co-design with consumers and also health practitioners who potentially will issue nature prescription, but also nature practitioners. So if you're interested, be part of this trial, and you can submit a very brief EOI via PowerLab website. But if you also health professionals and the nature professionals that you would like to work with us being partners, please feel free to contact me. That is a study I co-lead with Professor Thomas Estelberg at the University of Wollongong. But I think PANDA study is not going to be the last study on nature prescription, and I hope at least not, because there are so many things we need to learn. People are different. For example, people with high blood pressure, and comparing, such as people just get pregnant or after give birth, the nature prescription for them are very different, and also how we deliver them. They all remain questions. And so I would love to work with you if you're a researcher interested in this area, or you're health professionals and or nature practitioners or consumers. Would love to hear from you. And also to today's audience, I would like to hear your thoughts, how we could help people to connect with nature and help people get even more healthier and out of hospital. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Xiaoqi. That was fantastic. I will remind everyone, if you would like to ask questions, please do put them into the Q&A. We've had quite a few of them answered already. So while you're typing in your questions, I might start, and I'll start with a question for Alex. Fantastic research. And I'm just wondering, so where cities aren't meeting those policy guidelines and then they're not meeting the requirements, does it get followed up? And it's probably a broader question for the audience. What do you think the ethical implications are of that kind of where they're not meeting those requirements? Alex, you're still on mute, I'm afraid.
Sorry, thanks, forgot about that. Yeah, it can be quite difficult because the policies they're quite different across the states, and some are a lot more prescriptive than others. And so, a reason that, say, the Victorian policy was performing quite badly was because they're not as prescriptive, and they don't sort of hold developers or whoever else to account in constructing these things. They're allowed to maybe get away with a little bit more and sort of say, like, oh, look, the site context isn't quite appropriate, therefore I can't put this feature in, or whatever else. But I think, I think that sort of remains the challenge going forward, in sort of incentivizing good design, which, might sort of cut into the bottom line a little bit more, and how we can kind of get that sort of balance where developers are happy to deliver on that, and maybe, through kind of stronger provisions in the policy, or stronger wording of the requirements. So has that answered your question?
Yeah, and I'll follow up, just because there's been a lot of audience attention and kind of excitement around this as well. So other presenters might come to this, but I'm wondering, how does the mental well-being of apartment dwellers compare to the residents in other types of residencies or neighbourhood densities?
Yeah, so I saw that question. I thought I listened to Xiaoqi's talk, and I wasn't too good at multitasking there. But so I think that's definitely an area for us to look into as well. So we, the restriction of our study is that we were looking only at apartment dwellers, in that kind of more higher density context. And so that's a little bit of a gap, in that we're not actually quite sure how they compare against, their sort of suburban counterparts in terms of well-being. I mean, we might hypothesize, and again, we would need sort of data to back this up, that maybe apartment dwellers have a little bit more of maybe more stresses in their environment than those with a sort of, a bigger house, a yard, those kind of things that can help with well-being a little bit more. So we might, hypothesize that the well-being on average could be a little bit worse for apartment dwellers. But again, that's something we, we'd need to look at the data on.
Terrific. And Xiaoqi, there's a question also here. So Ray's said, I take it your study is focused on urban green space. I'm wondering if there is a comparison to suburban and rural environments, which naturally provide much more green space. If a bit more is good, is a lot better. So what's the threshold there? And are rural residents experiencing even greater effects, or is there a diminishing return?
That's a very good question. I haven't really do a lot of the comparisons. That's for me, right? I haven't done a lot of comparison between the rural and urban. Those populations are very different. People normally live in rural or urban, they choose to do, especially for people who live in rural. And you can see they may have quite a lot of green space, but whether those are green space, when we talk about, at least most of the time when I talk about green space, they are the public available space like a park, and then people can actually, or a community garden, people can actually access to and doing something. But the people in the reason I'm really interested in the urban space is because, as I also can see some of the other comments from our audiences, there's a less space that in the city, but more and more population come in. There are a high building, like, Alex research about apartment. But the thing is, maybe you still have the same amount of green space. Let us say council did not take it, now building more houses. But now you have from 100 households to access to it. Now you suddenly have another 500 households because a couple of blocks has been built. So then the ratio between green space and the population suddenly changed dramatically within a few years. So this is why I'm really interested in how we could potentially provide more space in a creative way, and for our local residents, especially in urban area, that they could access to green space and get all the benefits. But I certainly understand that when we say rural, for example, I have colleagues living in Blue Mountain, that's not even rural in Sydney, but if you get to the Blue Mountain, you feel very different from if, let us say, you live in Green Square area, one of the highest population density area in Sydney. It has park, but it's nowhere near you can get as the Blue Mountain.
Yeah, and kind of following up on this with Xiaoqi and Oliver even, and this is quite a basic question perhaps from me, but what do you think it is about the green space that's making the difference? Is it complexity, or are there any certain things that you look for within that green space?
That's very good, Isabel. I think this is regarding about the quality of green space. This is where we really want to learn more from the consumers. People may have different things looking at. Like you said, it could be the functional of the park, whether I could have a barbecue or running there, or children have playground. But some the function to people is not those physical function. It's simply whether they could feel this is an environment for them they can sit in to restoring, relaxing. But again, this will be meaning very differently for different population. I just also I showed that earlier there was a question for Alex in the chat box. I think Ryan asked about the type of the household, whether it's house or apartment. We actually conducted some work at Power Lab to show that what really interesting we find is that if you live in an apartment, it doesn't seem benefit your cardiovascular health, but it still benefits your mental health. We do have some hypothesis on that, but would be love to hear from the panel and also the audience, is that we think potentially the cardiovascular, why it has not been quite beneficial is, as I mentioned earlier, you have less space to use, even the same amount of green space. And so you may not have a lot of space for you to running around. However, you can still equally benefit by looking at it. and working. So those make a difference on the mental, or even meet your neighbors. But it would be good, love to hear, the panel thoughts or the audience thoughts on that.
Alex, Oliver, did you want to chime in there before we?
Yeah, I can. And but obviously, my studies I looked at the aesthetic value rather than the functional value, and were able, as other studies before me, to show there is this effect, especially for mental well-being, cognition, cognitive performance. So that there must be really something, I would say, evolutionary, that just the view of greenery and water just sets us in a different, provides a different mindset to us. So therefore, even if you don't have the space for allowing proper exercise and people literally sitting under trees, just enhancing aesthetically certain environments will already have a measurable impact as well.
And I think we can take one more question. There's a really good one in the chat, which is, does research tend to focus more on how to make new buildings and developments well, or is there also research around improving existing buildings? And I'd like to tie that into what I was saying a little bit earlier about ethical responsibilities. If we know there's a negative impact of current building stock that we have, like, what do we do? And is there research being invested in this area? Do we need to follow that up a bit more? So I'll open that up to anyone who wants to take it.
I could maybe speak a little bit to it in that, I mean, it's definitely quite related to the research that we do, but still that a little bit different in that tends to look at sort of housing quality and indoor environmental quality and those sorts of things. So that can sometimes be a little bit more around, like, is the construction quality, are there issues of damp, sort of cracks in the wall, that type of thing, which is definitely a very important issue and a huge, sort of body of research behind that as well. But then I guess sort of we look a little bit more at the kind of design side as opposed to the construction side of things. But I'd be interested in hearing what the rest of the panel thinks in terms of the accountability, I suppose, for poor decisions being made and who wears the ramifications of that, because I think at the moment it seems to largely be the residents that wear them. So.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And also I can chip in a bit. I certainly know that in UNSW, we have the School of Building Environment. They have a lot of research is actually looking about the way how we could improving the existing buildings from better to prevent the heat, and so we don't utilize just because we have a different color of roof, so ended massive heat inside of the house. But I also could say that such as City of Sydney, they actively engaging with their communities. So for example, people living in apartment, the existing apartment, they were engaging with body corporate or say the committee, say how they can make the building more sustainable from water and electrical use, and they will do free assessment and then see what areas can be improved and with a relative small cost. So I do think there are works around there, and I really hope there are more because there are a lot of existing buildings, and we hope it's not only just to make it livable, but also sustainable. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think we'll need to wrap it up there, but I do want to say before we close the event, thank you so much to all our speakers. Thank you to everyone who came along today as well. This event is part of a broader series, which is Pint of Science Australia, and that's happening in pubs and community venues across Australia from Monday to Wednesday next week. So please do come along. And lastly, if you've enjoyed this event and learning about this area of research, I do encourage you to keep on exploring and talking to others about it and sharing it. It's really important. That's why we're running this event, just to make sure there's awareness out there and people are really interested in this research area so it can keep on expanding into the future. So thank you everyone again, and I will close it there.